welcome to the Ideal Spaces podcast, the podcast that celebrates the ideal spaces of yesterday, today and tomorrow. I'm Flora Loughridge, creative director and host of this series. I'm joined by my colleague and director of Ideal Spaces, Ulrich Gehmann.
Hello everybody, I'm glad that you listen to our new podcast and I hope that it will be very interesting.
So in our previous episode, we spoke to John Marks about the responsibility architects have in designing buildings that people truly love. Buildings that have some kind of emotional meaning, poetry or beauty. Today, we'll also be exploring how architecture can transcend functionality, but this time with a focus on community and social development. We'll be discussing how good, thoughtful design and ethical practice can be a force for social change, and how the processes of design and construction of a building can be set up to enrich people's lives by addressing important social, economic and environmental concerns. We're delighted to welcome Manchester-based architect Jateen Lad onto the podcast today. Jateen is guided by his commitment to social value and environmental sustainability, and brings a holistic approach to all his projects, integrating high-quality bespoke architecture, environmental design and construction management in challenging international contexts. First and foremost, Jateen delivers buildings that are socially empowering. He recently gained international recognition for his collection of Sharanam buildings near Pondicherry in South India for the non-profit Servam. This highly unique project encouraged community involvement from beginning to end, from the design process, the training of local workers, to the upkeep of the building today. It's an incredibly exciting project and a great chance for Ulrich and I to ask some more questions about it. So, without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Jateen.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Well, we're delighted you're here. Now, I have to say, I am very intrigued to find out more about this journey you've come on in your career. You started out as an architect working really closely with private clients on corporate and luxury projects. But then you pursued a very different direction, and more recently you've been working on grassroots, community and social development projects. That's a pretty remarkable transition, so it would be really great to learn a bit more about how and why your focus has changed over the years.
Yes, I suppose designing and building for impoverished, undeveloped communities is as far removed as you can get from luxury homes for supermodels, rock stars, hotshot executives in fancy parts of London, and also designing extremely expensive fashion boutiques where the cost of a shirt was more than my monthly salary. Looking back, I obviously was very good at it and got slightly sucked into that superficial world, and even came to be seen by some clients as a lifestyle guru, which was frankly ridiculous.
Gosh, that's brilliant.
But this change in focus was purely a reaction to those types of projects and the ethical questions they raised about the practice of architecture. So it's a journey shaped by the experience of designing and making buildings and not any specialized study.
And was there a particular moment that inspired that shift?
Yes, there was. It was triggered by being caught up in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. I actually was on holiday in Pondicherry at the time in South India and witnessed the utterly harrowing scenes of devastation and grief. It was completely overwhelming. And there was one particular moment on the third day. We had heard about an outlying fishing community that had been hit and nobody had been out there. So with a couple of friends, we gathered some rakes and shovels and spades and we went out to see if we could help. And we came across the shattered remnants of a village where all the thatch huts had been absolutely destroyed and swept away. And as we approached, the women of that community came running up to us screaming, desperately beseeching us to go into the sea and save their men. They believed they were still alive, clinging to life somewhere in the sea. And, you know, these kind of scenes and experiences never leave you. Now, At the same time, the office I was working in London was carving a niche for itself, designing luxury eco resorts in the Indian Ocean, as it happens, where the very type of huts which had been destroyed by the tsunami were in effect being glamorized as luxury cabins. So all of this really triggered fundamental questions about the ethics of architecture and the nature of practice which I was involved in. We all understand architecture is a business, you follow the money. But where are the skills of an architect most needed? Where can good design be most transformative? Is it for a shipping magnate in Hampstead or a supermodel in Notting Hill? Or was it in the type of social context I found myself in? In which case, what is the potential of architecture? What can it really be?
And I imagine once you've seen scenes as shocking and saddening as those you witnessed in 2004, you'd look back and wonder what on earth was the purpose and value of that early work. I mean, do you think, looking back, that there was any?
Well, unless I missed something really fundamental, the value seems to have been very short term. It was basically lifestyle. It was where architecture and design get blurred with image and lifestyle. So I'll give you a couple of examples. On one project, we had a celebrity couple who had planned a publicity shoot in 12 months, and their large home had to be completely transformed. It was basically a high budget makeover. There was another case, a £1 million house renovation in North London, where the client's primary design interest appeared to be her dressing room, which occupied almost one entire floor of this large house. And I do remember being bombarded by fax messages back in the day, giving very precise dimensions of all the suits and jumpers and shoes which had to fit. It was very meticulous, but also it's nuts.
Pure luxury, eh?
Yes, this was pure luxury. And also about image. Remember, this was a very private space, a dressing room.
Did they mention why the image is so important? Because in this case of the private space example, if I expose my private space to an anonymous public, for instance, via Instagram photos or whatever, this space is no longer private. This is one point. And the other point is, if I deprivatize myself for the sake of image, why this image and for whom this image is so important?
Oh, I completely agree with you. These were projects to be photographed and published in lifestyle magazines, which promote not just the client, but also the architect. So it was always about designing a bathroom or a dressing room, a kitchen like it's never been done before.
Yep.
So technically and aesthetically for the architect, it's quite challenging in terms of detailing and making sure workmanship is absolutely spot on. But aside from all this about image, these projects were also about building assets, creating profit, further increasing the value of an already expensive property. If you spend £1 million renovating a 5-story house in Hampstead, you will raise the value of it by millions.
But this is an interesting point. No? First of all, as regards the value, you mentioned the value of architecture and of making architectural work. And related to it for these high-end clients, did these clients value what you built for them?
That's a really good question. Well, let me give you an example so you can decide for yourself. Before Pondicherry, I had just finished an expensive renovation of a historic apartment on the Thames near Downing Street. And the centerpiece was this stunning handmade parquet floor, which comprised of thousands of individual pieces of oak. And after completion, I went to photograph the interior. The first tenant had moved in and had dumped the biggest multi-gym on earth on top of this beautiful handcrafted floor.
Gosh, that's outrageous.
Yes, completely. So there is a conflict here between the short-termism which profits a client and the long-term thinking of an architect. And it was the long-term value which I was interested in.
And that's a very interesting contradiction. No? Mm-hmm.
Yes, and invariably you start to crunch numbers. And the analogy which kept coming into my mind was for the cost of one bathroom in that apartment, made out of marble, chrome, colored glass, ebony, granite. I mean, just listen to these materials. You could design and build an entire school over there and transform the lives of a generation of kids. So, given this imbalance, it's hard not to see the profession as being complicit in really sustaining and perpetuating inequalities. And in many ways, architecture is a very politicized profession. So, this led to a rethinking of my role and my purpose as an architect, and a complete shift to designing and building for deprived and marginal communities. And my work shows that these communities can also be patrons of architecture. With them, it is possible to create high quality architecture and achieve the same quality, the same detailing, the same level of workmanship. But design is never enough in these contexts. More than anything, you need to harness empathy to understand conditions on the ground, to generate uplifting and appropriate visions, attract the right investment, empower people. So you're not simply creating buildings, but also long-lasting assets and social and community value. And through this approach, architecture can become a force for social change, or at least improve conditions. Mm-hmm. And that is very much the belief that guides my work. And as strange as it sounds, the luxury projects seem to have been quite formative in this.
And I think because your work and ethos is far from just creating a nice or pretty building that serves a function, it's really about getting to the core of what a community needs and what the community's values are and how architecture can support them in the best way possible. So I'm going to move our discussion on a bit and ask you to tell me a bit more about the very beginning of a project.
Yeah.
When you start to shape your understanding of a community that you're building for, how their needs might translate into a suitably designed building. How does that work exactly?
Well, the short answer is I go and stay with the community for 2 to 3 weeks right at the outset when I'm commissioned. This really helps to build familiarity and an understanding of real conditions and issues on the ground. So it's a very different type of architect's site visit.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wondered who actually commissions you to do that work.
So I'm not commissioned directly by any community. I'm commissioned by charities, NGOs, non-profits, schools, even private individuals who all work with local people in some really difficult contexts. But every project begins just like any other. The client has got a very specific purpose in mind. For example, it's a mental health charity wanting a new campus, a school wanting a new sports hall, and there is some idea of the facilities and requirements, and that all gets developed. That's all fine. But compared to the luxury clients, these community-based clients, a building is a building. A purely functional concrete box would serve the purpose. But in order to transcend function, in order to generate this long-lasting community or social value, it's really the conditions on the ground that will shape the project, which is why it's important to stay with them. Because at the very start of a project, I have no idea what these conditions are, and so no idea of what the building is going to be. So my approach is really to think of architecture as a process of solving problems. It's a solution. So therefore, before designing the building, it's important to design the question. Otherwise, you risk designing the wrong building. So who is the community? What is their condition, their environment? What are the issues and hardships they face? What are their aspirations, their wisdom, their strengths, the beauty and ugliness, all the positives and negatives. And investing time at the very start of the project with all stakeholders, involving all stakeholders to build this question, to actually agree on this question, is also design. This is also architecture. And this is the stage when projects are given direction, they get enriched, This is really when you make your moves.
I think that's really interesting. I think this idea of designing a question is fascinating. I mean, it seems so obvious in a way that you should, allow the conditions on the ground to influence the direction the project takes.
Now, this is very interesting, Jateen. This is a total different approach than the one to be used for these luxury clients. There are no individual solutions for individual self-esteem or image reasons, also for selling oneself. No? Here it's about community in the Indian case, and you started with the most adverse conditions. This is very interesting. No? To consider the community as the prime factor, and therefore architecture is starting with a question and not with a concept.
Yes, and what I've experienced when you start building the question with everybody is the project changes. It gets completely transformed and develops a much stronger community focus. For example, I was asked to look at designing a sports hall for a school close to the India-Tibet-Burma border, so culturally located in the middle of everything. And when we started looking at the neighborhoods where the kids come from and the staff come from, it became very apparent that in this city of 500,000 people, there was not one tennis court, not one playing field, not even a proper place to take a morning walk.
That's appalling. It really is.
And this is very common in Indian towns and cities. Sometimes the only safe place to take a morning walk is a platform at a railway station. That's your leisure facility. So the project is now to design a combined school and community sports facility. It's no longer just about an education curriculum, but about the health and well-being of the whole city. And another example, which is quite unbelievable, is about 2 years ago, I spent 15 days at an orphanage and special needs charity on the outskirts of Tirupati in South India, which is supposedly the world's richest pilgrimage city. And this charity take in abandoned orphans and physically challenged children with mental illness. In fact, during my stay, on 2 occasions, an auto rickshaw pulled up to the gates and dropped off a helpless child. It's really sad. So I had been called by the charity to make adjustments to their existing campus, to make it much more sustainable. But in the time I was there, I noticed something quite different. You have this medieval mindset which abandons the most vulnerable children outside the city. But it was the people from nearby local villages. They perceived this shelter very, very differently. On very special family occasions, whether it was a birthday, a wedding, somebody starting a new job, somebody passing exams, these communities would come to the shelter, make huge donations of food, and perform voluntary service. So this was not just a shelter or an orphanage. It was also a temple where local people came to get blessings. So this project has now changed to explore how these 2 communities interact with each other, support each other in a beautiful and positive way. If I hadn't stayed with them and not looked at conditions on the ground or started building a question with them, we would have completely missed this and would definitely be designing the wrong building.
That's a very interesting point. Also, as regards the direct active intervention of a person, in this case of your person, as a very starting point to change the situation. And for me, it's another aspect of to start architecture with a question.
I agree. And I think this idea of an architect intervening at those early stages is crucial. And I'm wondering how that played out in the Sharanam project, which obviously has had a really positive social impact on the surrounding villages and the people living there. And a lot of that is due to the fact, I assume, that the building was entirely shaped by first understanding those awful conditions that faced communities on the ground. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about the context and background of this rural development project before we dive into the details about design and construction.
So the Sharanam Centre for Rural Development was commissioned by a new grassroots NGO called Sarvam, who set up after the tsunami to work in 2 hamlets, which were bottom of the scale in all the usual development metrics, whether that was education, health, life expectancy, income, sanitation, etc., etc. The area also had the highest level of alcohol abuse in the country. Amongst the lower socioeconomic groups, 90% of households had been destroyed by alcoholism, domestic abuse, and violence. This was really serious stuff. Anyway, Sarvam initiated a number of really pioneering development programs and visibly began transforming these 2 villages. That's about 7,000 people. And in 2007, they commissioned a purpose-built campus where they could expand their reach from 2 villages to 30, 40, 50 in the region. And the aim was to create an accessible place where they could host local communities in a whole range of development programs, with the ultimate aim of transforming rural life. So they had a very clear set of facilities, such as a large hall, offices, storerooms, kitchen, etc., etc. So it would have been quite straightforward to design a functional building. But I had become increasingly aware of the conditions on the ground. These villages were chronically underdeveloped and very, very impoverished. But it wasn't just poverty of money, it was poverty of food, poverty of health, poverty of education, of aspiration. There were no jobs other than bits of mindless labor for a week or 2. Nobody had employable skills. There was a real heavy inertia in these villages. When you went to these places, men would be lying outside, curled up, drunk, just passed out. Environmentally, things were no better. I know people have this image of an idyllic Indian landscape of palm trees and paddy fields, but so much of that has been destroyed, polluted, built over, covered in concrete, destroying traditional agricultural livelihoods in the process. So in order to make Sharanam more than just a building, the challenge was to tackle all these issues through architecture. And it was these issues that were going to shape the whole project. So the question that was designed was, can we create a stimulating contemporary building that was genuinely sustainable using local materials and local people in an ethical and socially empowering way? Now, this all sounds pretty idealist and quite loaded, but I think projects are all the better if you have these kind of aspirations. I do try not to be naive. I do understand that architecture doesn't solve acute social problems on the ground, but my attitude and approach is always that if we can improve conditions by 1%, then let's go with it.
And given your aspirations for the project, how would you say that your alternative, more hands-on approach differed from more conventional practice? Because, I find it very saddening to hear that it's so unusual for an architect to visit the construction site and have that full immersion in a project. I would have thought it'd be really crucial in a rural development project.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And also contractors now have increased design responsibilities. So in many ways, the role of the architect is just getting smaller and smaller. So the conventional way to deliver Sharanam would have been to prepare a design here in Manchester, appoint local teams and a contractor to deliver the project in India. And I would go out there every 2 or 3 months and, take all the credit. That really is how international projects are conventionally done. But the conditions on the ground demanded a very different, much more hands-on approach. So instead, I shifted to Pondicherry and set up an office with the help of my client. And in effect, the project had to be created out of nothing. There was no money, very, very limited professional support, and no regulated construction industry or professionals to kind of plug into. The project had to be driven and made to happen.
Yep.
So from the very beginning, the responsibilities included being a researcher and activist as you understand and engage with all the local conditions, being a strategist, defining the direction of the project, being a fundraiser, pitching to donors, Of course, being an architect, but designing every component of these buildings in step-by-step detail. Also designing the structure, the environmental design, landscaping, doing the cost management, and most differently, managing the entire construction. That means buying all the materials, paying the workers, and running a large, complex building site with all the infinite responsibilities and minute planning that entails. This type of practice is completely unthinkable on this scale in the UK, but given the conditions on the ground, it seemed to be the only way to do it. It's certainly alternative and holistic. Many people would call it risky. I prefer to call it fearless. It's 10 times the responsibility, but infinitely more fulfilling. And I just love that way of working.
Yeah. And it's often the challenges and unexpected twists and turns in a project that gives it real meaning. I'm curious to find out how understanding the community, designing the right question can then feed into the actual design of the building. In the case of Sharanam, you were building for impoverished communities who had no prior access to quality spaces and environments. So how did you go about designing the buildings, and what did you hope to achieve through the design?
Well, there were two approaches to the design. The first is, how do you design for the place, the region? And the second is, how do you design for these impoverished communities? So regarding place, the choices I considered were, should we imitate Western buildings, obviously adjusted for the climate? Or do we make better versions of what the local industry designs and builds? Create a heritage building? Then you really open up messy issues of what is heritage, who defines it, and you kind of end up gathering random symbols and probably misusing them and offending people. Or can we use the relative regulatory freedom of a place like India to create a building that would be impossible to build in the UK? And that was my approach. But of course, you have to use this freedom sensibly. It's not reckless freedom. So despite the context, the Sharanam buildings are contemporary, but they're not alien. They involve precision engineering. They're genuinely sustainable. It's not a concrete box with solar panels on the roof. They are scientific and based on calculations about net zero carbon, many, many years ahead of UK regs. So there is a deep scientific and environmental value which complements the people-centric aspect on this project. Regarding the people, I was thinking about deeper qualities the building needed to express. What do they need to convey? And I always kept coming back to the word dignity. Could this degraded wasteland be transformed into an oasis, an inclusive place of beauty and dignity for the poorest of the poor? That's really what guided the design.
I love this idea of the project then being built around this core value of dignity. I know you mentioned environmental and scientific concerns there, but something like dignity is surely so often forgotten in projects. I just think that's really refreshing to hear. I'll be putting some pictures of the Sharanam buildings in the show notes, but I think it'd be great now if we could enter the buildings, so to speak, and you could tell us a bit about what they look like from your perspective.
Yes, the Sharanam Centre for Rural Development is a 5-acre campus which, as I mentioned, has been designed to host local communities in a whole range of development programs. It's located 10 kilometres west of Pondicherry and sits at the edge of a landscape that's been totally destroyed by illegal quarrying and the dumping and burning of municipal waste. It's utterly apocalyptic. And all this abuse had spread to the Sharanam land, which was ecologically dead. But through reforestation, careful planting, and landscaping, the whole 5-acre site has been totally transformed, completely revitalized into a very lush sanctuary with a collection of buildings all integrated with nature. There's the main building, 3 offices, a large community kitchen, sanitation block, a biological waste treatment plant, a radio station, a newspaper studio, and recently some dormitories have also been built. And all of these buildings are built from the red earth of the site, the red soil. So very little concrete and steel has been used. The main building comprises an array of 6 very thin vaults made from earth, which weigh over 160 tons and were built without any support. And these provide a real sense of scale and atmosphere, and they span over multi-use spaces, which are much more human in scale, which are created by folding walls and level changes and ponds inside the building, water bodies inside the building. Very thick slabs of granite, local granite, step down into the main hall, which can hold between 50 and 250 people. There are very generous and deep verandas which spill out in all directions, merging with the gardens and also leading to private offices with their own courtyards and roof gardens. And I have to say, it's quite a large building, and the total footprint is about 2,500 square meters. But despite the scale, at a human level, it's a very playful building with imaginative spaces which are revealed as you move through it. It's a very open and inclusive building with very few boundaries, very few walls, filled with fresh air and breezes which just flow through it. And there's a good balance of generous community spaces, such as the hall and amphitheatre, and meeting and seminar spaces, all the way down to intimate personal spaces for individuals. You know, there are lots of niches, corners, perches, private verandas, all of which I think are equally important in community buildings.
I think it really helps us to see the space through your eyes, to picture the details, which of course, show in the photographs, but the tranquility, the scale, the power of the building, I can only imagine what that's like in real life. So we've talked a bit about the design of the building, but one thing that I would like to find out is how exactly you achieved a sense of cultural familiarity through the design. So taking into account the local traditions, the people, the place, how did you manage to integrate those aspects?
It's deliberately a contemporary building, but uses subtle cultural references to create familiarity. There's no pastiche. For example, the open pillars evoke the traditional Tamil temple, which is the public space par excellence. The massing of a large open superstructure with smaller closed volumes is again the language of temples in the region. The monumental granite plinth, which threads its way through the building, defining the main hall and the large stage, references the Thinnai, which is a multi-use platform from Tamil vernacular houses. At the same time, the design is rooted to this specific plot of land because it's made from that red soil, which was ideal for construction. The adjacent land had a very different soil, so this design would not have been possible.
That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. There are several aspects of real interest in my eyes. First and foremost, it's about respect. There's a respect for the local people, respect for the place, and respect for life. And the second thing is this discussion, for instance, this year's overarching theme in the architectural biennale in Venice about so-called resilient communities. I think it is a premise for being resilient, also to go back to one's roots and to stay there in a positively resisting way, and to be communal animal again, also, which is belonging to the human being as such. No? That for these resilient communities, you have to consider the place and you have to take respect in order to make meaningful projects.
Yes, this sounds so obvious, but respecting the communities you design for is vital. And there are many ways of designing in this respect. Firstly, through cultural references, we just mentioned. Secondly, respecting local perceptions and attitudes. So on all of my projects, I involve the community at different stages of design. I'm very careful. I never ask them what the building should look like. I mean, you can end up with some really wacky Disneyland type of thing if you do, and then there's no going back. But I do organize a whole range of Q&As, arrange visits, consultations, and placemaking workshops for very, very targeted aspects of the design. And very often the outcomes contradict the architect's instinct and fundamentally change the design. For example, at the mental health shelter project I mentioned earlier, the residents of that community were totally opposed to having private individual bedrooms, and they wanted to sleep together in dormitories. They were petrified of the dark, and this goes against all current research. At Sharanam, at the very early stages, local people had attached very colourful but negative associations with traditional materials. For example, half-round roof tiles, which for architects tick all the boxes in terms of climate and even aesthetics. But locals now identified these as encouraging snakes and scorpions and evil spirits. So can you imagine how disastrous these projects would be without that critical input?
Yep.
The third aspect is to respect the people for who they are. And this is so important with communities who've been downtrodden, perceived as worthless, bottom of the pile, who've been stigmatized. So the design of Sharanam is timeless. It looks as if it's always been there. It's simple. There's no random shapes or colors. It's clean and honest in the way materials are used, the way the structure is expressed. Nothing is really covered up. There was a need for scale and even power to create a tangible sense of feeling and atmosphere. So there is a monumentality, and this creates a sense of inclusiveness, of shelter, of refuge, which incidentally is what Sharanam means. It means shelter and refuge. It's also designed for comfort and well-being of users, so it's naturally ventilated. It's not air-conditioned. It's filled with fresh air. The quality of light is very soft and gentle. There's no glare. The natural acoustics of the building carry the sound of flowing water. And the spaces extend out and merge into the landscape with all its gardens and flowering trees. So now I'm describing it, I suppose it's a building which is very luxurious on the senses.
No, I agree. I think it sounds incredibly luxurious. And I really think that that quality of luxury is something that can be achieved not only through the use of materials, but it also goes back to this idea of respect, which we've just been talking about. You know, there's so much thought that goes into creating a building that respects the needs and traditions of the users. That's one thing, but you went on to involve the villagers themselves in the construction of the building, which is, of course, something else entirely. So it sounds nuts. I'd love to know how exactly that worked and what kind of skills did the villagers have coming into the project?
Yeah, Sharanam is possibly one of the largest modern buildings constructed entirely top to bottom by local people who were trained on the job in precision technical building skills. Deliberately, there was no contractor. And this setup, this community involvement, was a precise response to the local conditions we've already discussed, but also a response to the mainstream Indian construction industry. You know, in many parts of the world, like India, it's very, very difficult to build a well thought through, well put together quality building. The industry is fueled by appalling exploitation, corruption, unethical practices across the board. Anyone can call themselves a contractor, an architect, an engineer. There's so much fraud. There's real gross exaggeration of what people have done. And subsequently, new buildings look pretty substandard. And if you peel back the layers, nearly all construction sites look the same, whether it's a five-star hotel, a block of flats, or a government school, because they're all built from pretty low-tech, reinforced concrete frames. And they all use migrant workers, often including women, children, and there's even bonded labor in the supply chain. So typically, a construction site in South India would bring in workers from North India and vice versa. Why? Well, every contractor will openly tell you it's because that way workers cannot run away home. And they're made to work all hours of the day. It's never 9 to 5. There are no enforceable workers' rights. There's no health and safety, no welfare. And workers live on the construction site. They live inside, initially under tarpaulins, and then inside the building as they build it. There's no sanitation, no running water. It's incredibly dangerous. The number of people who are injured and killed is off the scale. There's absolutely no compensation culture. Well, it's up for negotiation, put it that way. In Pondicherry, if a worker dies after falling off a building site, you can reach a settlement with the family for about £1,000. That's the value of a life. And that's if you're pushed. So it's very callous. And there is a frightening human cost to these very substandard buildings. Human life just seems fairly expendable on most of these construction sites. So faced with this type of industry, the aim at Sharanam was to create an ethical building site that would be set up to employ and empower local people with no contractors.
This is a very interesting aspect with the socially empowering in these conditions you described. The socially empowering aspect is also an important point as regards the transfer, at least of this mindset, to involve a community in the building up of its own place to live.
Yes, that's right. And in order to involve as many local people as possible, there were a number of rules to provide encouragement. For example, no experience was necessary. There was no volunteering. Everybody was to receive full pay. This whole approach was quite audacious, as you can imagine, and a lot of people experienced in the development field said it was impossible, it was risky, dangerous even, because local people were perceived as drunks, lazy, untrustworthy, even violent. But I felt it was the only way to test whether architecture could be a force for social change. So one of our golden rules was that anyone entering the construction site gates had to learn at least one new skill.
I love that. That's a great golden rule. So what kind of skills were they learning, and could you give us some examples or personal stories of workers and how they became trained, and also what they're doing today? Because I'm assuming that there were so many benefits to them and what they could do after Sharanam because of the skills that they had learned.
Well, all the techniques to make a large building from top to bottom. So rammed earth foundations, manufacturing really strong bricks from earth, structural masonry, vaulting, metalwork, very smooth concreting, precasting, drainage, carpentry, stonework, and a whole range of final finishes. And all of these skills were done by hand using really simple tools. There was only electrics, which I still admit to knowing nothing about, that was outsourced to a local team. So everyone was trained on the job, step by step, through simple daily instructions which I would give, and often using very simple technical drawings, which incidentally proved excellent at improving literacy. But they also learned from each other, with more confident workers taking others under their wing. Now, this was a large building site with programs, continuous deadlines, trade schedules for every single part of the building. There was no time for training sessions or volunteers or photo opportunities. From day one, workers had to learn on the job, and they did. So in total, over 300 local people were employed and trained in the making of Sharanam. And there were 4 distinct categories. Over half were totally unskilled with limited or no literacy, and many of them were hand to mouth. One example is Ilango, who was the very first person employed as a security guard. But when construction started, he got involved. He learned how to make the bricks. He learned how to fabricate reinforcement cages using a really simple jig. And he became the gardener, which helped transform this wasteland. We had quite a lot of university graduates who, rather than work in a call center or in KFC, they wanted to learn technical and manual skills. And one example is Manikandan, or Money, as we call him. Yeah, he just got married in the past few days.
Oh, congratulations, Manny.
He's a great guy. He became multi-skilled and effectively became my right-hand man on site. There was this one unforgettable, real sort of high-pressure day at the sawmill. And on the spot, with all the machines running and time is money and all of that, Money calculated how to slice 4 large tree trunks into over 500 different lengths and sections with no wastage. No computer, no gadgets, just a pen, paper, and a really sharp brain. It was unbelievable. Now, many workers had some sort of casual prior construction experience. They were what we would call semi-skilled. And this included all the masons who basically only knew how to infill concrete frames with really crummy bricks. It was just all eyeballed. They had a trowel, but they knew nothing about bonding, pointing, string lines, plumb, tolerance, how to read drawings, how to set things out. They picked up precision masonry, precise to 1 millimeter, inside 3 or 4 days. And after the project, many became very, very decent contractors, the type I would certainly recommend. And then there were about 6 or 7 workers with a real latent skill with whom I learnt so much. There was so much collaboration. We did loads of experiments and really pushed the boundaries of detailing. Mustafa was a 23-year-old stonemason who laid stone flooring in apartments in his sleep. It's all 2-dimensional. At Sharanam, he learnt 3-dimensional stonework in putting together the monumental granite plinth and stage. And just to watch him work out how to sort of fit together hundreds of different pieces of granite with all the details was just incredible. It was actually very beautiful. And then there was Bhakta, who was quite an experienced plumber. But it wasn't his plumbing skills, it was more his values. He cared about quality, precision, perfection. He became the head mason. He had the poise, the temperament, the care, the seriousness, and the honesty to do the job in a way I have not seen on a UK site.
Brilliant. I mean, what an inspiring set of personal stories. And how fantastic that those workers had the opportunity to realise their potential and learn new skills. I mean, evidently, this is a construction site that was managed in a completely different way, where everybody's encouraged to try new things, learn new skills. And at that stage, it's not just about the building anymore, not even about the construction of the building. It's much more than that. It becomes much more meaningful. So, is there anything else that you think defined this project or made it different to any other project you've worked on?
Well, there were many differences, but the most fundamental was probably trust. In fact, I would say the entire construction was underlined by trust. As any practicing architect will tell you, construction tends to become incredibly adversarial. You have to spend as much time covering yourself against potential blame and liability as designing. But at Sharanam, I was blessed with total trust from the client, which was then transferred to the workers. And this really set the tone for the project. I mean, believe it or not, the workers set their own rates of pay. And nobody came up with anything outlandish like ₹1 million a day. It was just normal market rates. And receiving your due wage without a contractor or a broker or an agent or a boss skimming off 50% for no reason makes an enormous difference. It's incredibly empowering. So every Saturday was payday. The site, as always, would stop at 5 p.m. The workers would clean their tools, protect the construction, they would bathe and turn up 10 minutes later in crisp shirts and trousers to receive their pay. And on the wage slip, it listed what work they had done, how much they had earned, and what everybody else had earned. So the payment system was deliberately made transparent and incentivizing. One other difference was seeing workers photographing their daily accomplishments on their phones, especially as they became more and more self-confident. there was clearly an identity and bond with the building site. There was a real sense of ownership. And in fact, today, 12 of them are actually employed full-time managing and maintaining the whole campus. They actually run the place. But this is all down to trust.
And with that level of trust, I'm sure that things also got done a lot faster. So how does all of this manifest in the quality of the building from your point of view?
Well, the quality and detailing is comparable to the luxury projects we spoke about at the start. The brickwork, the walls, the piers, the vaults, it's all precise to a millimetre. The precasting work looks way better than anything coming out of a UK factory. The edges are so crisp and sharp. The stonework is so tight, there's no need for any grout. The full height, 3-metre high doors and windows, there's no warping in the timber. They open and glide so smoothly. All of the finishing, whether it's the lime and earth plastering, pigmented flooring, pebble flooring, the tiling, even the setting out of the switch plates, it's done so neatly. And whenever I show photographs to contractors and architects here, they really cannot believe this has been done by local people, upskilled and trained on the job. The workmanship is outstanding. It's really immaculate.
No, well, that's what you want. That's surely how you get a good quality building. So quick follow-up question on that. Quality, as far as I know, is pretty much always tied to cost. So I wondered what the overall construction cost was of this community approach. How did it compare to other projects you've worked on?
Well, believe it or not, the construction rate was less than 50% of a bog standard concrete building in the region. Plus, there's all the added long-term social, economic and environmental value. So the project really disproves that usual excuse for poor buildings, which is, that good design costs money.
I think it's a very crucial aspect.
Yeah, for sure. And so refreshing to hear that you don't have to spend outrageous amounts on a building to achieve high quality. And I think that's key to any project. A lot can be achieved through applying those qualities that we've spoken about: motivation, perseverance, collaboration, trust, as we've discussed. So now that we've looked at the design and construction of the building, I wondered if we could go back to this idea of architecture as a force for social change. Ulrich, I think you had something to say on this.
This is a very interesting point, referring in a positive sense to an old evergreen discussion as regards social change and the role of architecture, focused on the construction of ideal architectural environments, for instance, in ideal cities or in utopias. No? There's one perspective saying architecture, yes, it can change and even foster a certain direction of social change. And the other perspective, the other pole is denying it. It says, no, architecture plays no role. The minds of the people have to be changed. Architecture is a second best or accidentary phenomenon as regards social change. These are the two poles in the traditional discussion about social change and architecture. Architecture can do it and must do it, to provide a new environment, versus it plays no role.
Yes, and I have quite a centrist position on this. I fully accept that a building by itself, no matter how sensitively it's designed, cannot solve acute social problems. But a new facility, when properly used, can help facilitate change. And that really becomes the responsibility of the client and users. So Sharanam without Sarvam's development programs is not going to make any social difference whatsoever. However, I do feel the practice of architecture, where it is hands-on, where it engages and understands with local communities, can inspire change, at least during the duration of the project. And here Sharanam shows the far wider potential of an architect's role, what it can be, what social impact it can generate. So our aim was not just to deliver a nice building, but to improve long-term livelihoods and conditions through a much more meaningful practice of architecture. And during construction, the improvement in people, in workers, was really visible. Their whole demeanor changed, their outlook, their confidence, their self-respect. They were a different person from the one who arrived at the gates. So since the project has been completed, their trajectories have improved in so many ways. So many have become employable, skilled workers and tradesmen. Many have started businesses. Quite a few have become really decent contractors. I mean, ones I would recommend. And, they're all clearly earning a good living because suddenly everyone's got, quite expensive new motorbikes.
It's incredible. One question. What happens with the building today, as how it is used? And
well, the building was handed over in 2014 back to Sarvam. And it's important to say that as an architect, no matter how attached you get to a project and the workers, you have to let go. And now it's really up to Sarvam to utilize the building to its full potential. So they've been hosting their development programs from Sharanam and increased their reach from 2 hamlets to over 20. So that's from 7,000 people to over 150,000 people. And this has started to visibly improve conditions across the district, making communities much more healthy, much more resilient. As an example, education standards before Sharanam were dreadful, especially for girls. I mean, almost non-existent. They've now established exchange trips with high schools in the United States.
So this is a steep incline as regards local success of local people. No?
Yes, it really is. But if I'm honest, I don't think they're using Sharanam to its full potential. Sarvam remain quite a small team. However, a lot of other local groups are also able to use the building. Teacher training colleges, special needs schools organize programs there very often. The government regularly hold farming workshops there, and it's even become a popular venue for corporate conferences. All of which makes Sharanam a very unique space shared by all these different social and economic groups, which is quite rare in the sort of rigid segregation and hierarchies of, Indian culture. So the use of the building is far wider than accepted. And I think that's because the spaces were designed in a very non-prescriptive and flexible way. It's very much like a canvas which comes to life when people turn up and use the building.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also it's important, this idea of a building being flexible, that actually it can develop alongside growing or changing needs of a community. Building on Ulrich's earlier question, I wondered if there's an impact or measurement framework in place to collect data on the building as things develop.
Yes, there is. Sarvam regularly collect data through researchers, and all the developmental metrics are positive, in fact, very positive. But it's an ongoing process. Development is always incremental. It's even generational. So it will take time to really assess the impact, but it is looking very positive. What is undeniable, though, is that the spirit, the ethos, the values of the project really continue to manifest in hundreds, if not thousands, of lives in that area. Remember, this was an apocalyptic landscape. People had no income, no jobs, no aspiration, no energy. And something has been created out of nothing in a very, very beautiful, ethical, and transformative way. And as a fairly experienced architect, I can tell you that's quite rare.
Mm-hmm. Can this project be adapted to other local conditions for other local people? Because this is the most interesting general aspect in my eyes, at least, from a bird's eye perspective, so to say. In this case, a community is able to build its own building for its own place. And this relates to a long tradition as regards ideal spaces, a long tradition that went in the opposite way. Here it was the architects and the constructor in general, who decided how, for instance, an ideal city should look, or a planned city. It was all designed from above. It was a top-down planning and not a bottom-up planning, also to use this simplistic opposites. No? And here, this is very interesting. The people of the community, in a real bottom-up approach, the people of the community are making their own environment.
Absolutely. And based on that, my next question would be, can you apply the concepts behind Sharanam to other cities? Because surely there's a need for development in other places, for other communities. Do you think Sharanam could be seen as a model, or is it really a standalone project?
Oh, I think it can be a model, and not just in the developing world. I mean, there's an increasing need for development projects now in the UK and the US. Sharanam was shaped entirely by conditions on the ground, and those same conditions have become increasingly visible here, as so many of our communities have experienced quite alarming and rapid regression. Today, I see the same dimensions of poverty, whether it's poverty of money, poverty of education, poverty of health, food, environment, aspiration. It's so visible across the UK. Conditions which belonged in what we pejoratively call the third world, well, they're in our face here today, in spite of our enormous health and education infrastructure. And we're not just talking 1 or 2% of the population, but entire towns and regions. It's almost as if a fourth world has been created here, overnight.
Yeah. I think that this is a very crucial aspect when we are speaking about not only resilient communities, but about general conditions as regards the social and economic frameworks. And when we see these socioeconomic inequalities rising, it's a good point. What can be transferred in order not to evoke the impression, yes, as India, this is a total different case from, for instance, the United States. In a city like Los Angeles, the outskirts, as the majority of the city territory looks like in a third world country, like in cities I have seen in Pakistan or Kazakhstan or so. No? This is incredible. Let me put one not a concluding question, but in the direction of a kind of a conclusion, of a summary. Which could be realistic steps to take to examine each community to understand its needs and how to improve these needs, let's say, in a Sharanam-like approach? Is this possible in the Western world at all, as you have experienced working in the Western world as an architect? Or would you say, no, this is, despite the fourth world problem in the Western world, no, this is confined to other cultural spheres?
Well, as we just said, the same conditions are here. But I think, firstly, as you were just saying, Ulrich, we have to acknowledge we have this fourth world. Poverty in the UK might not seem as exotic as it might be in India or Africa. And I really wonder if that's part of the problem, if that's part of the denial. Now, in a place like India, you can harness the very relaxed attitude to regulations as a kind of freedom. And through aspiration, willpower, commitment, skill, and money, obviously, you can really create socially impacting projects from nothing. But in the UK, our much tighter regulations really control what you can and cannot do professionally. Mm-hmm. But our fourth world conditions need to be tackled collectively. And I think architects who empower communities through projects have a key role to play. Perhaps we need to redefine what it means to be an architect today. It's about combining design skills with research, with social and environmental activism. We need a better understanding of financing and the wider industry. And we need to actually make the buildings. Now, clearly, there is a growing hunger, especially amongst younger architects, in doing socially relevant, community-based projects. They're not so interested in designing luxury homes, as was the case maybe 20, 30 years ago. There is a discernible shift in social consciousness, which is so encouraging. The question is really whether things like regulations, insurance policies, the fear of liabilities will prevent us from working hands-on with communities. And these really have to be eased. These have to be negotiated.
Yeah.
And professionals equipped for this new type of social practice have to be far better supported. But I think the bottom line is, as architects, we have to be at the table, force our way onto the table. And if not, we do it ourselves.
Yeah, this is a good point, do it by yourself. And this is in a positive sense. This is the old utopian hope. Let's do it by ourselves. Starting with movements in the 19th century England, of social do-it-yourself approaches. And the point is, legal regulations are always an expression of power relations in a society. And this is a connex to be observed.
Yes, but I don't think regulations are entirely insurmountable. There is clearly a need to maintain standards, but also a need to encourage without being so restrictive. And community projects can really benefit with greater openness at all levels. So reward professionals for taking wider responsibilities. Don't penalize them. Think of financing not as a risk, but as an investment in people. Validate on-the-job training. It's far quicker and more effective than 4 years in a technical college.
Yeah.
And give high-quality manual skills the respect they deserve. Then we can start opening a pathway to replicating the scale of work over here. But there is one guarantee, that the results will not be bland or soulless. The collective sense of working and learning together is incredibly rewarding and transformative. And I think Sharanam has demonstrated the benefits of creating architecture through that spirit.
Yeah, I think you're right. We need to make it more about opportunity, learning, equality, and really value those aspects. Because, clearly something remarkable happens when architecture is brought right down to the level of the community, the people who it can really impact most of all. And then we see that it can be a real force for social change. So I'd like to wrap up today's discussion. So thank you, Jateen, for joining us on the podcast today and sharing with us your experiences and insight into your projects and practice. I've personally found it very refreshing and rewarding also to peel back the layers, so to speak, and talk about the core value of architecture and just how transformative good, honest design practice can be.
Yeah, Jateen, so many thanks for your really, really interesting insights on a concrete project. No theory, but a concrete project. I think the issues addressed in your project are worthwhile to be looked at more closely, in particular as regards their transfer to other situations outside Sharanam. For instance, in our fourth world. Many thanks, Jateen.
Well, thank you both very much. I've really enjoyed our discussion.
Finally, a quick message to all our listeners. Please do visit Jateen's website. Have a look at the show notes below. You'll find a selection of photos of his projects, past and present, and they do really give a very good sense of the beauty, power, and purpose of his work. And will also give you an insight into the construction process and people who are involved in the Sharanam project. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe to the Ideal Spaces podcast and leave us a comment or review below. Thanks again, and see you next time.